Perfect. All righty. So, as I mentioned, my name is Alan Castro. I am a fourth-year history student, and the title of my research subject is Agent Seeking Agency, the Iran-Contra Scandal, President Reagan, and the Trouble with How We Understand the CIA. So let's get started. Depending on how familiar people are with this era of American history and politics, I'm sure you're familiar with this picture. This is the only person who really faced any real lasting consequences for their role in the Iran-Contra scandal, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and here he is testifying before Congress. The Iran-Contra scandal was the Reagan administration through the CIA selling weapons to Israel, who would then sell them to Iran. And that money would get funneled back to the United States, laundered, really, and then used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. It would never make its way back to Washington. The whole idea was plausible deniability. That way, if it was uncovered, which kind of seems that it was known that it might following the Nixon administration and everything that happened in the 70s. You had that degree of plausible deniability. That's always key with everything, right? As long as you can deny it to some extent, that's all that matters. A good lawyer can argue their way out of anything. With that being said, the three research questions that led this body of research was to what degree do the executive and legislative branches view the CIA as a panacea, or it's kind of like a hammer to resolve complex foreign policy matters? What lessons can be drawn from the Iran-Contra scandal that rocked the Reagan administration yet left its legacy intact? We do kind of see that now with the Trump administration, how despite there being so many cases against the Trump administration, nothing really seems to stick. At least anything that's really lasting, as well as how can we reimagine the CIA within the context of the American system. They are situated in a very interesting place, being the only intelligence agency that operates outside of the Pentagon, and also being the only agency that the president can directly appoint their director, as well as kind of tell them, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. Here we have a couple of pictures of President Reagan and his CIA director, William Casey, who also served as his campaign manager during the campaign of 1980. Interestingly, you can make of this what you will, but William Casey is considered to be the man who sort of salvaged Reagan's campaign and kind of really pushed him to the fore as far as Republican nominees was concerned in the 1980s. And then here we have a former CIA director turned vice president, George H.W. Bush, shaking hands with William Casey, and we have President Reagan in the background. So case study information. As I mentioned prior, the Iran-Contra scandal is the arming of Nicaraguan Contras using funds garnered from weapon sales to Iran, with Israel kind of being used as a proxy. And then the Contras are going to be counter-revolutionary fighters that were fighting against the FSLN or Sandinista government that deposed the US-backed Somoza regime in 1979. It should be noted that the Sandinistas are still in power to this day, though their reign has been kind of broken up with two presidents that were not from their party. Though one of their leaders, Daniel Ortega, remains in power, and he has had uninterrupted power in Nicaragua since the 90s, or I think late 90s. So nothing really stuck. Like everything from the Iran-Contra scandal, Reagan kind of went on to become, up until recently, it was the party of Reagan. So nothing really stuck from there. And the Sandinistas just had to basically continue fighting for their cause. And the Contras never really overthrew them. And then here we have Reagan and Nancy Reagan, with Reagan having a Stop Communism in Central America t-shirt. The methodology, being a historian kind of going into political science, it was a bit different. It was a learning experience. So it was a lot of primary and secondary sources to kind of see the dynamics within the CIA as well as within the White House. And it was very interesting to see how there was a separate line of communication between President Reagan and William Casey, and Casey bypassed a lot of the CIA's internal bureaucracy, kind of acting on his own, usually leaving out his deputy director, which is why you do see a lot of deputy directors under William Casey. There was like a rapid succession of them. The one that lasted the longest was Bobby Ray Inman, who was there basically to kind of appease the bureaucracy, since he was I believe, an admiral for the longest time. But again, there was in Casey's own, well, there was two books that mentioned this episode in Casey's own autobiography, as well as Bob Woodward's, I forget the title of the book, but Bob Woodward notes that there was an episode where Bobby Ray Inman barges into Casey's office, where he's with one of the underlings, as well as Oliver North, kind of just, planning out the Iran-Contra scandal as it developed, and just outright quitting because he was, there's a lot of expletives, and he was just very tired of being bypassed, and kind of knowing that if the Iran-Contra scandal blew up into the public sphere, that it would be disastrous for everyone's careers. It turned out not to be disastrous. Oliver North was for the longest time the NRA spokesman. He was the leader of the NRA. So again, nothing really stuck. As well as analysis of academic and historiographic sources to kind of understand how the Iran-Contra scandal is portrayed in academic spheres, both political science and history. With that being said, there's two frameworks that I was able to glean from the academic sphere, and that's presidential preeminence, which is basically the president operates above Congress's powers. This is something that we do see Nixon hinting at, as well as President Trump, where as long as the president does it, it's not illegal. And this is something that, again, as long as you have a good lawyer, they can argue for that. And then shared powers, which is much more to what I think a lot of people tend to, at least I like to think, tend to think of the government as working as, which is three co-equal branches, with there being an executive, but the executive not necessarily being supreme, right? There's no one leader, it's just three co-equal branches with checks and balances. But again, we see time and again when there is overstep, there is a tendency towards arguing that, well, they're the president, therefore it's not necessarily illegal, they're just doing what needs to be done, bypassing the deep state or the bureaucracy or what have you. So the goal with my research was always consistently trying to find something that bridges that, where there is no longer that argument of, well, they're the president, so it's okay if they do this. And that kind of led me as well to the principal agent problem, which here, the principal being the CIA, the agent really conveniently being the CIA. What happens if they're not in agreement? Which with Iran-Contra, it's a bit interesting because you have two instances of that, predominantly being in the lower end, where the CIA as an institution, the bureaucracy, didn't necessarily gel with William Casey, but regardless, Casey was able to co-opt people such as Oliver North, who was a Department of Defense employee, to see his plan to come to fruition, which was basically just combating communism in Central America. And he didn't need the CIA, as it were, to complete that, to do that task, which is very interesting. Because again, what happens in that situation is, does the agent have enough agency to be able to push back against their principal? What happens in that situation? Are they just fired for unsubordination? These are kind of questions that I've been grappling with, but haven't been able to really find a definitive answer, because there's always the lawyer question, right? If someone can argue against it, then that still leaves the bigger question of like, well, it doesn't really answer anything, because you're just kind of running into the big problem of it can be argued against. And that kind of leads me into the end of the presentation. There were no convenient answers. There was nothing really brought out of this other than legislate, just being in that situation. It very much seems that as long as there's good lawyers involved, and as long as you have plausible deniability, it very much seems that one can get away with anything as long as you have a good lawyer. Which again, it very much seems that Reagan was acutely aware, since there were a lot of passages where it doesn't take a lawyer to see that there was a lot of plausible deniability baked into the whole thing. A lot of do what needs to be done, just don't let me know. Um, and yeah, and that's kind of where I would like to continue my research. Just demonstrating that I remember early on reading Graham Allison's Essence of Decision and being really interested by the different lenses approach and wanting to demonstrate that from the perspective of Reagan and Casey, they were in the right. They were just protecting American interest abroad. From the perspective of Congress, they were undermining the democratic process by using these back channel means of conducting diplomacy. With that being said, I would like to thank my faculty advisor, Dr. Paul Denary, for really providing me with a lot of mentorship and being an excellent faculty advisor, as well as the University of California, Riverside, for really providing me the opportunities to pursue these questions in a more academic setting, and the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship for opening doors that have really advanced my career and have been they've enabled me to ask these questions and look into these things. There's my email if anyone's interested. I have amassed a lot of knowledge in the Cold War. Just in history, that's my area, the Cold War, specifically as it relates to Latin America. With political science, I'm still very much a novice, though. And then here's my bibliography if anyone's interested. But with that being said, that is everything.